Hello, my name is Jackie Marchington from Caudex. I'm Director of Global Operations, and today I'm going to be talking about ORCIDs. First of all, just to disclose, not flowers. I'm talking about the Open Researcher and Contributor ID initiative that is going around at the moment, and if I was talking about flowers, I would definitely not be good for gardening tips. So a non-floral version of ORCID is the Open Researcher and Contributor ID, designed primarily to disambiguate author names. There's a quite famous paper with about 256 authors on it, 38 of whom are all called Wang. So distinguishing between those 38 Wangs could be quite difficult. Individuals with ORCIDs are associated with a persistent identifier, a bit like a DOI for a paper, which is attached to that researcher throughout their entire career. ORCIDs are integrated between databases, other databases which are linked with publication processes, peer-reviewed journals, grant submission processes, and that kind of thing as well. So the idea of ORCID ultimately is to be able to identify a particular author with their contributions throughout their entire research career. This is my ORCID record. You can see I'm commonly known as Jackie Marchington. I'm also known as Jacqueline Marchington, which is my full name, and I was married a few years back, so I've got publications under Allars, Jackie and Jacqueline Allars. So I've got 4 names, 1 ORCID ID, and I have 2 Scopus IDs, of which I was totally unaware until I opened my ORCID account. I can attach all my publications to my ORCID account. You can add details of education, employment, and funding sources too. So it's quite a comprehensive one-stop shop for finding out about researchers. This is my public profile, anyone can search this, and I can choose what you can see. Why do agencies care? Why should agencies care about ORCIDs? Actually, there's a huge potential leverage in having authors associated with an ORCID ID, which would really help our workflow processes. One of the mission statements from ORCID is on this slide to provide a global central registry of researchers across disciplines, institutions and sectors. And the idea is that rather than each submission mechanism for things like Scholar One, Editorial Manager, having their own database of authors, they all tie into ORCID and pull the information from the same source. So you haven't got authors maintaining several different registration sites. So last year we decided to do a small survey study to submit to the European ISMAP meeting, looking at the potential impact of ORCID on agency life and how agencies deal with manuscript submissions. We wanted to know how widely required ORCIDs were, how compulsory they were, and how simple they were to use. So what we basically did was logged all of our manuscript submissions for the first half of 2016, January to July. And we just wanted to look at the kind of journals we were submitting to, so publishers, whether they're open access or not, whether they're associated with a society, and their ORCID requirements, whether they weren't mentioned at all, whether they're mandatory for submission or voluntary. We also looked at where we wanted to know of the authors who needed an ORCID, how many of them already had ORCIDs. So we found over the first 6 months of 2016, we made 51 submissions to 45 different journals and over 21 different publishers. And in that time, only 2 journals demanded a ORCID entry on submission to their journal. 14 made no mention of ORCID at all. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you might find that 14, 31 and 2 actually adds up to 47, not 45. And that's explained by the fact that 1 journal during our observation period shifted from no mention of ORCID to optional ORCIDs, and 1 shifted from optional to mandatory. We didn't find any particular association with society status, so those journals which were affiliated with the Learning Society were no more likely to demand ORCID than others. Okay, 2 are with the society, but the sample size is so small I don't think you can infer anything from that. Similarly, open access status wasn't particularly associated with demanding ORCID IDs on submission either. For publishers, the 2 mandatory ORCID journals were both published by Springer. And of the other journal publishers which had optional ORCIDs, it tended to be one way or the other. So all these journals, except for Wiley, all of their journals were optionals, and Wiley had 6 optionals and 2 no's. So not that widely spread, and it's all fairly optional with the major publishers at the time. With the authors, of the 10 authors who needed an ORCID for submission, only 3 already had them. The remaining 7 authors were happy enough to create an ORCID. When we asked them to, we could talk them through the process, explain how easy it was. But from an agency perspective, just knowing the ID wasn't enough, because the submission systems require you to log on to, when you enter your ORCID ID, you have to log on to your account to authenticate the data transfer between the journal submission site and the ORCID account. So that was potentially problematic for journal submissions. So what? It was very interesting, but what does it actually mean? At the time of the study, ORCID use was optional for most of the journals that we were submitting to, and it didn't present that much of an obstacle, really. There was no association between society journals and ORCID requirements, between open access and ORCID requirements, or particularly at that time between publishers and ORCID requirements. But in November 2016, about 2 weeks after we submitted our EU ISMAP abstract, Wiley announced that they were introducing mandatory ORCIDs for submissions across their entire portfolio of journals. And since then, other publishers have followed suit, requiring ORCID entry at submission. So what was not particularly problematic for us in our survey is now becoming more of an issue for agencies assisting with submissions. So for propagation, getting back to the gardening theme, agencies are well placed to encourage ORCID propagation. We can ensure that the authors we're working with take out ORCIDs early in the process so it's not holding us up later. We do handle a high proportion of manuscript submissions, anything from just providing the finalised files to the authors for them to do their own submissions, to doing the full submission process where it's permitted, or there are various proxy options now offered by some of the publishers that allow us to submit on the author's behalf. ORCIDs can streamline the submission process because once it's associated with the author's account for that journal, then you never have to enter it again. The information is pulled through. So once we've submitted to that journal once, we don't have to worry about getting details for the author again. And imagine not having to enter all those affiliation details for each author when you submit every time. We have one at the moment with 47 authors on it. I'm not looking forward to that one. There's an element of pest control built into ORCID as well. Just knowing someone's ID, as I've mentioned before, doesn't allow you to authenticate their account. There is a status you can grant other ORCID owners called trusted individual status, which allows you to edit that ORCID person's account. I don't want our staff having that information. I don't want to be editing people's ORCID IDs, ORCID accounts, and also it doesn't help you do that authentication piece for the submission process anyway. How do you prevent unauthorised breeding of ORCIDs? You can't associate one account with one email account with more than one ORCID, so that's an element of control there. But if you change organisations and forget you had an ORCID, you can take out a second ORCID. So it is possible to kind of mess up the system, if you like. But you can search for existing records, and there is an option on your account at the bottom you'll see to deactivate records, to remove duplicate records. I've not tried to remove a duplicate records, I don't have one, but I'm hoping there's some kind of merge with existing accounts option in there as well, so you can pull two accounts together if you accidentally create two. I mean, again, agencies can help with this because we can just run through an ORCID. It's very easy to search the system by name and spot potential ORCIDs already exist for our authors. So we could say, is this you, before we go and encourage them to create another account. So how might ORCIDs evolve? The proxy submission services I've mentioned already could build ORCID into the workflow. But at the moment, if you're asked for an ORCID, it stops the process. We have to wait, get the account authenticated, and then move on. If the build is for the proxy submission services, just has the ID in, and at the end of the process, the whole thing goes to the author saying, please validate your account and agree that this is a kosher submission, then that would be great. And ORCIDs for meeting abstracts would be so good, again, particularly for those sites which don't allow you to save partial submissions where you have a lot of authors. Being able to pull all that information in one hit would be absolutely wonderful. Save so much time and angst for everybody. And there are already other interconnected systems that are using ORCID. A couple of years ago, we had a presentation at the US ISMAP meeting from a lady called Heather Pierce, who talked about Convey, which is a global disclosure system. So users open an account, they log all their disclosure information. It can be anything, financial disclosure, it can be non-financial conflicts of interests. And the system is then associated with grant awarding bodies or journals or what have you, and they say what parameters they need to pull your disclosures, and you can automatically generate a disclosure statement which is relevant to that particular agency. So you're not having to do one for 2 years, one for 3 years, one for 5 years. Now this system already includes ORCID. So imagine if your ORCID ID was associated with your Convey account and your journal used Convey, you could just auto-generate a disclosure statement for each paper which was accurate, and the agencies wouldn't be saying every time, it's not the same as last time, you have to have a new disclosure statement, it's different, it's a different time period, there are different parameters to pull. So that's already in existence, and I gather there's some behind the scenes work to try and make this work in reality with journals. Also, Publons have built ORCID into their API, so you can get credit for peer review activities built into your ORCID record too. So it helps academics build their publication record, their contribution to the research area, the whole research community via their ORCIDs. So it's already there. There are quite a few presentations on SlideShare actually. If you go to SlideShare and look at ORCID slides, you can see where ORCID is starting to help pull things together and make things simple, almost like a one point of entry for academic credit. So, from Little Acorns, I recommend anyone who has a publication anywhere to go and get an ORCID if you don't already have one. Once you've taken an ORCID out, you can start to see what it can do. You can explain it better to authors who you may need to encourage to create an ORCID account. The whole system for ORCID is community-driven development. So if you're part of the process, you can make enhancement suggestions. For example, for transparency, I've already suggested that we can add a medical writing support. So medical writers, for example, could claim publications they've worked on. And if you're a member of ORCID, you can be part of the solution. So that's it. My gardening tips are done for the day. So thank you very much.